6 Democrats voted against it. We had 132 votes in total against going to war. And ever since that time, we've been trying to get to 218 votes so we can turn this country and this war around. Over the last 4 years, this war has been fought with virtually no sense of shared sacrifice. Military families have done double and triple duty, while the rest of America has had to accept the sacrifice of a tax cut. That's about all that's been asked of most Americans. We've spent a huge amount of our national treasure, and now the President is asking for another almost $100 billion for this war and asking for an additional $3.5 billion for his own domestic priorities. This bill is our response. It says to the President, okay, you can have that money, but only under certain terms and conditions. And we try to do three things. Number one, to redirect a greater effort to the right war in Afghanistan rather than the wrong war in Iraq. Secondly, we try to protect our troops to the maximum extent possible and correct the neglect that they have suffered as they have returned from the battlefield. And thirdly, we are trying to send a message to Iraq politicians that they need to change direction, that we will no longer tolerate an open-ended, interminable babysitting job, that they must get together and begin to resolve their own differences. This bill sets a timetable for repositioning our troops out of Iraq. The exact timetable will be determined by the performance of the Iraqis and whether or not they meet important political and military benchmarks. And this bill establishes a target for finishing our redeployment in any circumstance. It recognizes that our troops won the war, but it also recognizes that the President's plan calls upon troops to do something that they do not have the power to do, namely to convince Iraqi factions to reach reasonable compromises on their own turf. It sets reasonable conditions for moving our troops into a different posture. It holds Iraqis accountable to standards that the President himself has laid out, and it puts us in a new direction with respect to the war in Iraq. And it does some other things too. It completes action on a number of leftover pieces of business that the previous Congress left to this new incoming Congress. The President himself asked for $3.4 billion to deal with the needs of FEMA. We are also finishing action on the BRAC action, which requires $3.1 billion in additional funding. We are finishing action on the need to improve family military housing to the tune of $3.4 billion. We are finishing action on rebuilding the lives and providing other assistance to the Katrina victims after the most devastating natural disaster in the history of our country. We are finishing the action on the agriculture disaster problem that Congress wrestled with for well over a year in the previous Congress without coming to resolution. And we are providing the final $1 billion in funds to combat a potential pandemic flu, funds which the President himself requested in an emergency appropriation in the year 2005. And we are also finishing action on the action begun last year by the Congress in trying to deal with the fact that 14 states are going to run out of child health money, and we need, therefore, to provide $750 million to see to it that low-income families and children in low-income families are not pushed off those state health care rolls. This is a request that's come in from Republican and Democratic governors alike. And we've also provided some additional funding above what the President asked for, items which are not last year's business, but which we think are important in terms of this year's business. We are increasing funding for veterans' health and defense health by $3.4 billion. We are on the Homeland Security front increasing funding substantially. The President, since days after 9/11, has been resisting virtually every congressional effort to add funding for Homeland Security, for border security, for cargo security, and the like. We are continuing the effort to provide significantly more money than the President has asked for. If anybody wants to argue with that, I'd suggest they take it up with the 9/11 Commission. I'd suggest they take it up with the Hart-Rudman Commission. I think they'd take it up, or I'd suggest they take it up with the 9/11 families. Everybody but Ann Coulter, I think, would be responsive to what those families think. And then we are also providing $1.2 billion in additional funding for our war in Afghanistan. Mr. Speaker, I sat at CIA headquarters and watched right after 9/11 as our Predator aircraft were searching Afghanistan for bin Laden. And I know what the people at that agency were saying when they expressed their frustration that the President was diverting a huge share of our resources in the hunt for bin Laden to prepare for the unilateral attack on Iraq. What this bill is trying to do is to correct that by again refocusing additional attention on the war against Afghanistan, and I make absolutely no apology for the funds that we have in here. Some will say this is not a perfect instrument. They will differ with the timeline that we have for the repositioning of troops, and they will differ with the benchmarks. But what I would say to them is that what is important in this document today is not the exact wording. What's important is not the exact timetable. What's important is not the exact enumeration of benchmarks. What's important is that for the first time, this Congress will be exercising its constitutional responsibilities to provide real oversight on the executive branch of government, and we will be trying to set this country on a new direction. Someone in this House said last week that we are similar in our position to a board of directors for a corporation. He said the President is the CEO. The President's cabinet represents his management team, and we're the board of directors. And when a board of directors of a corporation sees that the management of the corporation is leading it down a disastrous path, it has a fiduciary responsibility to its stockholders to step in and correct the problem. That is what we're trying to do in this legislation. In this case, we have a fiduciary responsibility and a representational responsibility to the taxpayers and to our constituents, and we're trying to meet that responsibility today. Now, there are some who criticize us for doing so, some in newspapers and some on this floor. Very frankly, I'm getting a bit tired of those who are consistently wrong from the beginning on the issue of Iraq. I'm getting tired of them lecturing those of us who were consistently right from the beginning in our opposition to this this war. And when people ask me why we don't have a better solution, I tell them the story about Eddie Stanky, who used to play second base for the New York Giants many years ago. And one day, Leo Durocher, the manager, I yield myself 2 additional minutes.
Just 2 additional minutes.
And one day, Leo Durocher, the manager, was hitting ground balls to the infield, and Stanky dropped 2 in a row. And so Durocher grabbed a glove and said, "Here, kid, I'm going to show you how it's done." And he went out to second base, and the very first ball Durocher dropped. And he turned to Stanky and he said, "Kid, you got second base so screwed up, nobody can play it." The fact is, if you substitute George Bush for Eddie Stanky and Iraq for second base, you've got the picture of what the problem is today. Now, this Congress cannot run foreign policy, but it has an obligation to try to influence the policy and influence the conduct of that policy when we see it headed down a wrong path. Mr. Murtha has tried to lead the way in seeing to it that we face up to those responsibilities, and this legislation will give us an opportunity to do that